William the Conqueror and the Norman invasions of England. William the Conqueror was a man who would live in a time that would come to contain many events that would change the history of not only England but of the territory that surrounded it, changing the lives of many in numerous and different ways, and leaving an impact that would go on for decades and centuries after the event. Several individuals would be affected by the numerous events that would occur during this time, including battles that would go down in history as history-defining battles, with lots of things depending on their outcomes, sieges that had massive impacts, and interactions, negotiations, and meetings that would determine the fate of millions. We will spend time exploring these events. William would live to make a massive impact on England and its future, as well as the future history of Normandy and of Europe. He would become Duke of Normandy in 1035. In England, with the death of Edward the Confessor, William would move to invade England with a Norman army, an event that would contribute to the start of his own reign. He met several challenges throughout his reigns. His maneuvering around these challenges would come to define some of his successes as a leader and as an individual. His rivals would include personalities the likes of Harold Godwinson and Harold Hardrada, and the later parts of his rule would be characterized with struggles and uprisings in several regions of the territory he would come to occupy. In this podcast, we will explore his life story, taking a look at the factors that made William the way that he was, including a look at some of the challenges he would face and how they would contribute to the eventual development of his legacy. We will also take a look at the events that surrounded the Norman invasion of England, looking at the power struggles in Normandy and taking a further look at the uprisings he would come to face and encounter as ruler of England, and some of the rebellions and power clashes that would come about. Some time will also be spent exploring the changes that would come as a result of his rule in England and some of the events that would follow his death, looking at a timeline of his life as well as events that had occurred before his reign. William had been born in 1028 in Falaise, Falaise being in the Duchy of Normandy. His wife would be Matilda of Flanders, and she would continue to be mother to several of his children, including William II as well as Henry I. She continued to have some influence on some of the events that would occur. His father had been Robert the Magnificent, and his mother Herleva. 1027 would see Robert his father ascend the throne as Duke after Richard III, his older brother, amongst some level of controversy. Amidst some suspicions, several parties would be vying for several sorts of power during this period, but Robert would be able to gain support during the tumultuous time as well. 1035 would see several events, amongst them would be the death of a significant one. It also saw journeys and a change in power. It saw Robert go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The pilgrimage followed some changes he had made in property that would concern and benefit the church. But prior to that, he had undertook actions that helped to support William's claim to heir. Robert would not make it back to Normandy as he would die on his way back. This left the young William as the heir to the throne. Certain factors would arise that made William's childhood challenging and difficult, including issues of his birth, power struggles amongst several parties, and other issues. William was very young at the time, but his ascension to the throne would have supporters. Gaining full control of the throne would be a process that would take a long period of time. 1037 would see several events, including the death of Archbishop Robert, great-uncle to William. Archbishop Robert had played a role during his rise. His death would have an impact on events that would occur during that time. Power struggles would also emerge like they had before, and would see several changes in the custody of the young duke. These changes would occur several times over the years. Many years would pass on with events of their own which would affect numerous people in numerous ways. 1046 would see opposition to William arise. Guy of Burgundy would be one of the leaders of the opposition in rebellion. He was a relation of William, but he wouldn't be alone in this rebellion as several other people would join him. Events would eventually see William flee. 1047 would be an important year that saw many changes occur. It would see an important battle in the form of the Battle of Valais Dunes and the return of William to Normandy. The battle would have an impact on the reign of William and would change things somewhat. It had involved forces of Henry I as well as forces of William, and would occur in Normandy. It resulted in a victory for William and Henry's forces. It would also see the defeat of the Norman rebels. Several factors would play a role in the outcome of the battle, amongst which would be Ralph Tessin and his forces. They would come to fight alongside the royals. Another contributor to the result as well was the difference between the quality of leadership on both the sides. Years of conflicts would follow, however, which would see many events occur during that period. Some of these events would have an impact on the overall period. 1049 saw marriage between William and Matilda arranged in the Council of Reims. 1050 as a decade would see him married to Matilda of Flanders. It would also see the exile of the man who was a relation of William and had also been a leader of the rebellion against him, Guy of Burgundy. 1051 would see the death of Hugh IV of Maine. He had been the Count of Maine for more than a decade during his life. The general period also saw the exile of Godwin. 1052 saw Godwin's return to England, and his lands would eventually be restored. In the following year, in 1053, Earl Godwin dies, which would have some ramifications. His sons gained more influence. He had reigned from 1020 to around 1053 as the Earl of Wessex. He had wielded large amounts of power and would continue to play important roles in events during his life. He is succeeded by Harold, his son, who would eventually rise to the throne of England. Tostig, another son, would become Earl of Northumbria, rising to this title around 1055. His daughter Edith is at some point in time the Queen of England, as she is married to Edward the Confessor. 1054. Invasion launched against the duchy. Some events would occur through the county of Évreux, and some of the events would occur in eastern Normandy. The invasion was by King Henry and some Norman rebels. Events around the invasion would see the participation of individuals like Robert, Walter Giffard, William de Warenne, and other individuals. These individuals would be in support of William and would play their roles in their different ways in the events that would come to unfold during this period. Battles like the Battle of Mortimer would also occur during this time. This battle in particular would be won by the force on William's side. Other events would occur, and one in particular would concern an archbishop who would go by the name of Archbishop Mauger. The resulting events would see a change in the position that he occupied. The period would be important in determining the future of William and his relation to power in the Duchy of Normandy. It had seen some fighting between some of the forces present. In the course of events, some notable individuals would be captured in an event that would involve numerous individuals. 1057 would be marked by yet another invasion, this time by Henry and Geoffrey Martel. Battle of Varaville would occur during this period and would result in victory for William. It would ensue sometime around August and would come to involve numerous individuals. Edward the Exile, or Edward Atheling, goes back to England. His son is Edgar the Atheling. Edward dies at some point in time during this period. Edgar's family had played a role in England for decades before him. Some of those who had come before had been kings of England. Edgar's grandfather had been Edmund Ironside. 1058 would see several events, some of which would concern William. It saw Tillières-sur-Ever and Themert taken by William. Amongst some of the events that had occurred over the course of the year or the general period would be the commencement of the siege of Themert. Some of these events would see the direct involvement of Henry. Events here would at times see the presence of individuals, the likes of Count Ralph IV of Valois and Count Theobald III of Blois. 2 years after some of the events of 1058, 1060 would see Count Geoffrey die, which would have impacts on William and his power. He had been Count of Anjou for a long period of time and had been involved in conflicts with William. King Henry also dies in the same year. 1062 and the general period around it would see expansions into Maine by William and would also see the death of Count Herbert II of Maine. This would be followed by several changes that would concern Maine and William. The two events that had occurred in 1062 would be linked, and William would claim a stake in Maine, which had been a neighboring county of Normandy. Maine would later on, and long after the events around the Norman invasion of England, be invaded by Folk-Lorican, leading to conflicts between forces under William and those under Folk. Other events around Maine at other times would involve other actors, the likes of Hubert de Beaumont of Maine, which would lead to conflicts between him and William. These conflicts would involve a long siege and end in William's success. Fulk had been the successor of Geoffrey III to the Countship of Anjou, and he would reign for decades, eventually dying in 1109, 1064, invasion of Brittany by William. Some of the events that would occur around this event would benefit William in some ways, and would have some bearing on the later invasion of England that would follow a few years later. 1065 would see events occur that would have widespread consequences, including the exile of Tostig and the emergence of a rebel favorite in the form of Morcar. A revolt in Northumbria would take place. Morcar would emerge as the rebels' choice to replace Tostig. The rebels would be supported by Harold. 1066. King Edward dies early in January. William would be amongst those who would claim rights to the throne in England. And the period that followed would be characterized by conflicts to establish who would gain the throne. Several other individuals also claimed the throne. This included Harold Godwinson and Harold Hardrada. As Edward the Confessor lay dying, he would apparently name Harold Godwinson as the next king. But William had a counterclaim on the issue, arguing that the throne had been promised to him by Edward. The 6th of January would be a momentous day that would see the crowning of Harold. The southern coast of England would be the site of several attacks by Harold's brother Tostig. He would be supported by a fleet from Baldwin of Flanders. Other regions and sites during these events would include Lincolnshire. By the end, Tostig would find himself in Scotland after the events that had occurred. William would make preparations for an invasion over this general period and in the time surrounding it. A fleet would be built by William as well as by Harold. St. Valery-sur-Somme would be the point of departure, and the force would be made from individuals from several places and regions. Some of the regions and people would have a significant stake in the coming events. Several factors would come into play into William's decision of when to land the force. On the other hand, Tostig and Harold were not lying idle and had made inlands into Northumbria in the general period. There would be conflicts between them and Morcar and Edwin. 1066 would see the Battle of Fulford, which would occur in Northumbria and would see the involvement of several forces. The end result would be victory for Harold and Tostig, who had joined forces. The events would also result in some changes in territory, including those in Fulford. We will explore some of the events in the battle here. Battle of Fulford, 20 September 1066. The fighting here at the Battle of Fulford would occur sometime in September. It would end in the defeat of the English forces that were present. Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia would be present, as well as Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson. Harold Hardrada was claiming the throne, and he would arrive in England with numerous forces in support. Prior to the battle, January had seen the death of Edward the Confessor and the rise of Harold Godwinson to the throne amidst several challengers, amongst whom was Harold Hardrada, William, Duke of Normandy, and Tostig Godwinson. In the past, Tostig would have battled Edwin the Earl of Mercia separately. The events of the battle: the English would make moves to protect their flanks. The position they would occupy would have certain disadvantages. The English forces would attack, and the fierce fighting would be filled with maneuvers and other moves in order to achieve the best results for either side. At some point in time, the English forces would be split from each other, and several fronts of battle would occur. The outcomes of the fighting was the victory of the forces under Harold Hardrada and Tostig. The surrender of York would soon follow, followed by other events like the Battle of Hastings. The River Ouse had been a significant location or marking for the battle that would occur. We will end the first part of the video here and pick up on the second part in the next video. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos. Also, like the video.